Welcome to another edition of Regulatory Ramblings Briefs. Our guest today is Dr. Kuzi Charamba. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the HKU Faculty of Law, and he's written an interesting paper entitled Beyond the Corporate Responsibility to Respect Human Rights in the Dawn of a Metaverse. It's quite a attention-grabbing title, and I think the concept of human rights in the metaverse hasn't quite caught on because people are still trying to come to grips with the metaverse itself. But Kuzi, thank you for joining us. And what was it you were trying to get across? What was the cardinal theme of this paper? What was its central thesis that you were trying to drive home?
Well, first, thanks for having me on the show, AJ. It's a real pleasure to be talking with you guys and to share a few of the musings or thoughts that I had in this paper. And I think that's the key point here. It's musings about what could be on the next frontier of business and human rights. So at the moment, we have a global framework for business and human rights, which is largely underpinned by the UN guiding principles. And this framework sort of lays out a state duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, and a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, to look out and see how they can mitigate and remedy the impacts that they might have from their corporate activities on individuals. And so as we move into digital spaces where these corporations now largely control and dictate the ways that individuals can act, interact, and transact, the questions that I'm trying to get at are whether we need to focus more on the responsibilities and potential duties that corporations should have to protect individuals' human rights in these spaces that they are now effectively acting as sovereigns.
It's interesting you mentioned the point about sovereigns because we're not talking about one metaverse, and I don't think they're all connected either. So in a very real sense, you're right, they are all sovereigns because it's a multitude of turfs. So with that, the question of who will protect individual rights in the metaverse is unclear. I mean, that implicates jurisdiction. Who has jurisdiction, enforcement? How would that play out conceivably?
It's an interesting question because the premise of international human rights law is based upon what we'd call maybe a vertical relationship between the state and an individual. And this individual could either be a natural person or a corporation. And so there's an assumption built into this framework of the corporation or the individual being a subsidiary to the state. It has that authority. And corporations and individuals have this horizontal relationship. But if we move into a digital space where the corporation is now essentially dictating how the individual will be able to act and interact within its metaverse, then we could begin to see a situation whereby they no longer have this horizontal relationship of juridical parity. The corporation is now moving to a hierarchical superior position to the individual within that space, dictating the ways within that individual can interact and act and transact. And so if we do that, then we're essentially changing the paradigm on which international human rights law is built upon, which means that potentially the corporation could and should have more responsibilities or duties to protect human rights in that space, because theoretically the positions have changed.
Either that or states get more active, right? I mean, in that at the end of the day, this is a recurring theme, that you can't access the internet without servers. Servers exist in real physical locations, which nation states can exercise jurisdiction over. But heretofore, governments don't seem to be that keen. I mean, they seem to, and maybe that's how it always is. Business and technological developments occur, and then the law catches up. But I mean, the dynamics of the metaverse are constantly changing. We're hearing about things like Web3. It's unclear to me regulators and policymakers necessarily know what to regulate or how to regulate it. Or is it just a matter of expanding current telecommunications law?
I mean, there are a few interesting elements and themes in that. And, the first to pick on would be, yes, technology tends to evolve at a much quicker rate than law is able to keep up with. And so how we can ever get to that dynamic position where the law can keep up is a perennial problem and issue. In most cases, we'd probably need principles in order to allow for that adaptability and dynamism. But again, going back to this issue about the state being ever more present with its tools, we typically find that stronger states with good governance regimes are able to be stronger protectors of human rights within their jurisdictions, right? They're not perfect, but they do have the machinery and frameworks to be able to do that. The places where we need to protect human rights the most are at the fringes or the frontiers or the penumbra, where the state's governance and authority is waning. And so there isn't that much presence, and that doesn't even need to be within a digital space, right? We see it in conflict zones or in places outside of the capital of some states. And that's when we really need to step up the efforts to protect in those gaps. And so in a similar thing, as we move into new frontiers technologically, are we moving into spaces where the state doesn't yet have a grasp or a handle with its authority to be able to provide the protections that it should?
From what I've seen as a journalist, when, say, members of the U.S. Congress or Senate call tech CEOs before them, oftentimes they're grasping at the outer edges. They're not quite sure what they want to ask. And at best, the questions are very rudimentary. I mean, I want to come back to this point about regulators and policymakers, that they need to be more forward-looking rather than reactive in terms of regulation of and governance in the metaverse. Where do we see ourselves 20 or 30 years from now in a global community? And that globalization in many areas of finance is already the norm.
Yeah.
In terms of rules.
Yeah.
Do you envision that for the metaverse?
It is exciting because innovation, and particularly technological innovation, is allowing us to do things that we haven't done before necessarily. The fact that we can have these new global communities or cloud communities that are able to interact and transact. So let's say you have a marginalized community that doesn't have a physical space in the real world to be able to meet. Maybe LGBT communities in some places in the world could have a space
to call their own.
Yeah. They could have a space within a metaverse where they can do that, right? But it will require this sort of insertion or installation of guardrails to ensure that innovation is happening responsibly. And I think that that's going to have to come from an interaction between companies and states or governments, and B, a stronger assumption of responsibilities by those who are creating these spaces to realize that there are real impacts from these new worlds of innovation that they're creating. And, without being cliche, with great power comes great responsibility.
And assuming that type of harmonization of rules took place, then we could expect to see a greater acceptance of human rights in perhaps even places in the world where they might not be accepted right now. A recognition that nation states and corporations can't do anything. Just as we have harmonization of rules of finance, one would like to think then that you would see harmonization of human rights. But then some might say, well, you're foisting the Judeo-Christian model of the West on the rest of the world. That questions about what should the rights of minorities, women, religious, ethnic groups be it's so culture specific. But as we know in public international law, there is a concept called jus cogens that, nation states post World War II, the notion was that nation states can't do anything they please within their own borders.
Yeah. I mean,
And yet the truth of the matter is the long arm of the law only extends as far as it can be enforced. There are places in this world where certain members of the UN Security Council seem to get away with things with impunity.
I think first on the point of harmonization of rules, we do have a body of international human rights law instruments that, we can fall back on,
Charter.
right? You've got the UN Charter, you've got CEDAW, you've got a whole range of instruments where the law has pretty much been set. The question now arises as to what extent could a corporation potentially assume some of those obligations in the same way that we have laid out for states, which is going back to a debate that's been going on for a long time as to whether corporations could be subjects of international law, right? There are many perspectives on that. But again, going back to the earlier point that I was trying to make, which is if they're assuming authority and jurisdiction over individuals in spaces that they create, then potentially this is not definitive, but more fuel for the argument that there might have to be further assumption of responsibilities within that space. And just on that point,
Because you're a sovereign.
over the space that you're creating, yeah, I think if you're a big tech company and you're creating a space where you're controlling data, you're controlling the ways that people interact, you are filtering the comments that come in and all sorts of behavioral conduct, then yeah, you are acting as a sovereign in some ways. But there's an interesting historical point that we can go back to, which is in the 17th and 18th century, we had the concept and reality of company states, such as the East India Company, right? And they would be formed in one jurisdiction and they'd go forth to unknown territories and have jurisdiction and authorities to make laws and rules and regulations in those places.
Under a royal charter until the Crown said, no, we want to take full control.
Right. So that might happen, but prior to that, they had that authority, right? And so, again, going back to this theme of technology advancing.
Because that scares a lot of people, the notion of corporate states.
Sure. But in many ways, it's here and it's happening. So can we extend principles within frameworks that are already there to almost provide like this stopgap measure as we collectively think about what rules we would like to have applicable to corporations that are creating metaverses? It's a question. I don't have an answer, but it's a question.
I know that as a principle in international law, when we talk about sovereign immunity, for example, that I haven't studied it for a while, but I mean, I remember if a state gets involved in the marketplace and does things that a state would normally not do, then in that instance, sovereign immunity doesn't apply. This is almost the reverse. This is imbuing a corporate state with the powers and authority of a government, a national government, in which case, okay, if you're going to behave like the East India Company on the Metaverse, we expect more of you. The view being that can you really expect a corporation to look out for human rights because their driving goal is profit?
Yeah, and I think if we get past the point of saying that yes, they are wielding a great degree of authority.
In some
in
cases,
these
greater
spaces,
than nation.
right?
Some corporations have greater power than nation states in this world.
Absolutely. If we can accept that as a general and first premise,
Yeah.
then the next question becomes what rules become applicable to the exercise of that authority. And I think that there needs to be, and in some places we are having this conversation about what the rules should be and how those rules should be made, right? So it might not necessarily be that vertical dictation of responsibilities by a state against a corporation, although in some cases it might be necessary. I think the case that we could better envisage is one of discourse between these powers, corporations and states, and civil society as well, to have an open forum within which we can talk about the principles that should be applied to protect human rights in these spaces. If we haven't yet come up with particular international treaties or legislation that we would like to have applicable yet.
There's a sense, though, and I talked to some people, some of the techies in Silicon Valley in my work, and that when you put it to them in those terms, that the rules of the road that we arrive upon for tech, for the metaverse, should be arrived upon precisely as you say, through discourse, through the corporate sector, technologists, all stakeholders, government, and the public at large. That seems to be, because many of them seem to be of a libertarian bent, you're holding back progress. You're delaying me from doing God's work, in a sense.
Yeah.
Lloyd Blankfein's attitude to Congress post 2008, that former CEO of Goldman Sachs, that you're delaying financial innovation. You're delaying progress. You're holding me back from doing what I need to do with all these countless rounds of questions and arguments and deliberation, and that's what the people in the technology sector are like. They're like, to me, it's about the deliverables. It's about moving the technology forward, which benefits mankind, and you're holding me back from that.
Yeah. I can see that, but there has to be a sort of yin and a yang and guardrails for innovation to take place, right?
Because these things don't exist in a vacuum, and their actions have a real impact on the world.
Absolutely. And, to bring it back to reality or something more concrete, we've seen in this current crypto winter that a series of debacles have led to real impacts for consumers around the world because of different frauds and token schemes, which have essentially taken a lot of money away from individuals, while we have used technology to create what could potentially in the future be new ways of transacting with one another. Right? And so the technology is there and the innovation is happening.
And it has its virtues.
But the value and the way that innovation is happening needs to be done in a way that doesn't have, where the negative impacts outweigh the positives. And so it's about innovation within a responsible framework, and we manage those risks and opportunities.
My own view has always been on that point, that you can't be a de facto member of the financial system and not be subject to any rules. That is the assumption that a certain rabid anarcho-libertarian fringe within the Bitcoin early on and then later the broader crypto movement seem to adhere to.
Yeah.
That, don't bring the bankers on board. The moderates were saying, bring the bankers on board, make it more mainstream, get more mainstream acceptance and respectability. Harmonization of rules is important if you want to become mainstream. And they were like, no, the purists were having none of it. Nothing to do with the bankers, nothing to do with anyone else. This is all peer-to-peer. Those that want to play can, and we should be subject to no regulation. And I think there's been a realization that was a discussion of the last decade. That chapter is closed. There's going to be regulation. It's just going to be a matter of what are the parameters now.
Yeah, and just to sort of touch upon that, because I think it has a very interesting intersection with what we're talking about in Metaverses, which is the state's jurisdiction or real-world implications, right? And at least if we're talking about financing crypto, these digital communities where they're looking for peer-to-peer interactions, smart contracts, etc. And they've got these touch points where crypto can be converted into fiat and vice versa, right? So you've got this intersection.
Where mainstream finance interacts with, crypto.
Right. And in the former, where we now move back into the world of the state and fiat currencies, we do have the state wielding its authority in that traditional classic hierarchical relationship. In the DeFi community, in the crypto community, much as we will have in the metaverse communities, I think, the relationship is going from hierarchical to heterarchical, right? It's going from peer to peers interacting with one another as communities, setting up these rules and principles. The irony of that, though, is that...
And that is the anarcho-libertarian ideal.
Sure. But the irony of that is that even within any community, there's going to have to be some sort of determination of what the community rules are.
Correct.
Right? There's a centralization at some point, some sort of discussion as to how we, as a community of individuals, interacting on a global basis, want to determine the rules for one another. So those principles are going to arise.
So if we borrow down, this is something we discussed before, that the first case of someone who claims to have been sexually harassed, sexually assaulted in the metaverse has already occurred.
Yeah.
And so the dichotomy between one's physical and digital personality and how to set up appropriate governance systems for that so that no one's dignity is assailed seems to be a quandary. Is such an injury actionable? Does it rise to the level of state enforcement action, bringing the law enforcement into the picture? And for corporations in the metaverse, the answer, this matters because it could spell liability.
It's an excellent question, and one that we need to figure out pretty quickly because, these realities are coming much quicker. But if we let's look at this legally, right? If my avatar was to do something to your avatar, the grounds for us to potentially make a claim could go to either I sue you as but do I sue your avatar or do I sue you as the physical person, AJ, in the real world, and we go to court? Alternatively, which I think is a possibility, alternatively, do we now need to create a system for the administration of justice within the metaverse that allows for my avatar's rights to be protected against yours? And at that point in time, am I also then able to make a secondary claim against the corporation for potentially having community rules that might facilitate that or allow for that, right, to the corporation? So it's now bringing in the traditional notions and ideas of a state machinery for how we interact and transact with one another.
This is, again, you may think I'm going off in the wrong direction, but the parallels to this are what happened at the Oscars last year. Chris Rock could have sued not only Will Smith, but the Academy for Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences for not, ensuring his safety.
Yeah, but that's more happening in the real world, right? And those cases,
and people get that. People understand that.
Yeah.
But the metaverse seems like such a fringe, silly concept to a great many, that the attitude is, oh, those are just kids playing their games.
True. But if we are going to have more people working in that space, more people interacting in that space, more people having a sense of identity in that space in the future, if not some already now, then yes, we're going to have those questions of the administration of justice between individuals, be it for tortious claims, be it potentially for criminal claims, property claims, tax claims. There is a question not only of me against you, but the potential responsibilities of those who create the space within which we are interacting, right? Whoever's programmed or designed that metaverse, if it's a corporation,
that they breach their duty of care.
What is their duty to ensure that these situations are not happening, right? There's a concept of due diligence that states have now. under international human rights law to ensure that private parties, in some cases, do not violate each other's human rights by the state acting upon those individuals, right? Or creating the situation for that to not occur. Could we not have a similar situation in the metaverse?
It had been pointed out to me a long time ago that when I audited my first course in cybercrime, that we should not construe cyberspace as its own domain, that crimes in cyberspace have their real world analogs, and therefore it is up to the student, it's up to the practitioner to see what a crime in cyberspace, what its counterpart is in the real world, and learn how to apply the law to those facts as creatively as possible. So it is not the case that we don't know what to do. The rules are there, but a level of savvy and sophistication needs to arise to understand how to apply them to cyberspace, because it's not its own domain. It's a seemingly new realm. But if you apply the common law rules sensibly, it can be done. They can be rated. Again, the average person sees the VR as an indulgence, as a diversion. They equate it with video games, and certainly for many of us growing up in the 80s and 90s, that's how we were introduced to it. I mean, that, or if you were engaged in computer-aided design, other than that, I don't know who else used VR. But you know, we had a guest on Regulatory Ramblings, Bruno Larval, and his company exists exclusively in the Metaverse. And he said that you're going to see more people working in the Metaverse, because if it's a choice between working off-site, working from home, or working in the office, he saw people working in the Metaverse as a healthy medium, because at least I can see you.
Right, right. And, you know, I should point out that as we move further in this conversation around cyberspace, we will at some point hit the limits of my expertise. I do think you're right in that there are examples and extensions that we can make from our current legal system into these digital spaces.
But will it require a new Bill of Rights?
Maybe, but I don't necessarily think that the rights would actually change substantively. I think what would be interesting is the process with which that bill is made in order to ensure that people abide by it. Because if you're looking at a community system, or that hierarchical system that I was mentioning earlier, it's not one person coming in and imposing it and therefore being the enforcer and regulator and supervisor. It's a community of individuals who are trying to self-regulate and self-police. And so what's more important is, you know, not more important, but the substance of that Bill of Rights is probably less important than how that Bill of Rights is made.
As in who did all, well, I think implicit in what you're saying is, did all the relevant stakeholders, did all segments of society get a say in how it was crafted?
Correct. For that digital space and that community, for it to have the legitimacy that it's going to need in order to be effective, particularly if we don't have that overseer, which has typically been the state, then it's going to be really important how we make those rules. And then again, coming back to the original point that we're making, is that the corporation that is creating this metaverse, in lieu of those community rules, or how those community rules are made, they may still have an additional responsibility. I don't want to say obligation just yet, but responsibility to ensure that the community is able to operate in a way that does not negatively impact people's human rights in those spaces.
Well put. In the time we've got left, is there anything you'd like to leave our viewers and listeners with? Is there anything you feel we didn't discuss? Any point you'd like to raise?
Yeah, I think that this is a really exciting time in the technological space for the possibilities that this could bring about, right? Whether it's for finance, whether it's for social purposes. But I just wanted to reiterate, rather than say something new, that these are musings and the beginnings of a conversation that we need to have, because the rate of technological innovation is such that it'll be here before we recognize it, and we want to be ready for that. So can we begin to push forward that conversation of potential principles, and can we be bold enough to have a conversation about what the responsibilities should be for those who are creating these new digital spaces, where the state might not always have the reach to be able to be that supervisor that it's always been.
Well, Kuzi, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And to our viewers, thank you again. Until next time.